Hello, New Covenant Community Church. Today we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 50, verses 20 and 21. And as we do that, we're ending this kind of Advent series where we're going through some texts in the book of Genesis. I know that we've skipped around a lot, but what we've looked at so far is this one who's going to come, and we're seeing at the end of the book that God is going to bring about some of the things that were found at the beginning of the book, particularly good. Right, so God is going to work things for good, a word that we saw a lot at the beginning of the book. But how did we get here? Well, we got here because Jacob's sons were going to kill their brother Joseph, but instead of killing him, Judah had the idea that they were going to sell him into slavery. All of that happened in Genesis 37. And then in Genesis 38, so they sell Joseph. In Genesis 38, there's going to have this, Judah is going to have children, right? His line. So I'm just going to put Judah, his offspring are going to be discussed here. And then we're going to see in Genesis 39 through really 40, all the way to chapter 50, we're going to see Joseph and his brothers interacting, and they're going to end up coming into Egypt, and then Jacob's going to follow them into Egypt as well. There's a lot that happens, so that's an oversimplification of what happens. But we knew that this was going to happen because in Genesis 15, if you remember, so Genesis 15, they were told that they were going to be slaves in a country not their own for 400 years. That was what was going to happen. So for 400 years, they were going to this country. Well, in Genesis 49, really back in Genesis 46, they go into this country. They're there, but they're not yet slaves. This is how they got there. They're actually favored and treated well at first. And here in Genesis 50, Jacob has died. He's passed away. And what's going to happen is the brothers are going to be, so you got Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Gad, Naphtali, Zebulun, and so on, right? All of those brothers are going to be worried that Joseph is going to try to take their lives now that their father's dead and he's the one in charge. And Joseph has already kind of allayed these fears. He told them back in Genesis 45:5, "Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." And then Joseph talks about there's been a famine in the land for 2 years, and there's 5 more years of famine to go. God has sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So Joseph has this very God-centered perspective on how he got there. His brothers did something evil, but God is the one who's actually working the things out in the end. So in Genesis 50:20, he's going to kind of, again, allay their fears. He's not going to take retribution on them or anything like that. And so notice the pronouns here. As for you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. So here what it's trying to say is the brothers, what did they want? They wanted evil. That was their intention. Their intention was evil. But God, what was his intention? His intention was good. So God's intention was good. And what's the point? What good did he bring about? To bring it about that many should be kept alive. The same thing he said in Genesis 45, really 5 through 6. Right? So this, and then verse 7 as well. So preserve a remnant, to keep alive, to preserve life in Genesis 45:5. God sent me before you to preserve life, is what he said there. So I'll just write that down. Genesis 45:5, preserve life. So they meant evil, but God meant good. Now, notice what he had said back in Genesis 45. God sent me here. Right? You sold me into slavery. God sent me before you. This doesn't say that God uses it. Like they did something evil and then God's reacting and he uses their evil for good. He doesn't say that. He says, you tried to do something evil. God did something good. There's a difference there. God is the one who's in control, right? And you've got this idea that permeates this text, right? So you've got the death of Joseph, the brothers choosing evil, and then you've got this idea of good, and he's going to talk here to be kept alive. So he's got death and evil, life and good being contrasted. So I'll put like death and evil in red, right? So death and evil versus life and good. You've got this contrast going on. So in verse 21, he says, so do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. So Joseph says, I will provide, right? So we've seen that language in the book of Genesis before, particularly in Genesis 22, with the Lord being a provider, and he comforts them. He speaks kindly to them. But I want to just end with a reflection on this death and evil, life and good. We saw this exact word pair, like these two word pairs, death and evil, life and good, at the beginning of the book of Genesis. Everything was good at the beginning. Everything was characterized by life. There's the tree of life, and then there's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And if they eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, what are they going to do? They're going to die. So we've got this idea of death and evil, life and good at the very beginning. We've got the concept of where they are in the land, the preservation of life. They're not inside the land right now, and they're trying to journey back to the land. Of course, it's going to be over 400 years until they can do that. But what the book of Genesis is opening with is that humanity chose death and evil. And what Joseph is saying here in Genesis 50:20, he's saying God is working out something good. Even though humanity has chosen death and evil, God has chosen something that is good and something that is characteristic of life. So we're going to see this pattern throughout the Bible. When they crucify Jesus, they are choosing death and evil. But what God is doing is he is showing life and good. These exact same ideas are going to come back up again in Deuteronomy 1 and in Deuteronomy 30. And in Deuteronomy 30, especially verses 15 through 20, Moses is going to be standing at he's going to be giving a new law to the generation who was raised in the wilderness. And as he's talking to them, he is going to tell them that he's going to tell them to choose life and good and not death and evil. And what he's doing when he's saying that is he's saying, don't be like Adam and Eve. Choose those things that are patterned off of God, those things that are life, those things that are good. Don't choose those things like Adam and Eve chose that are death and evil, so that you could be in the land that God has given to you, which they were about to enter at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. And there's a lot going on there. But at the end of this, in the end of the book of Genesis, I want you to see that God is working something out. He's not merely reacting to what Jacob or Joseph or Judah or the brothers are doing and using it. He is the one moving these things to happen so that God's people will be preserved, and there will be a child who will be born who will bring a blessing to all the peoples of the earth. This is the movement of God's history of redemption, and this is the movement of the gospel.